Hook up! Didi, run!
You want to know what turns a modern city into the most dangerous place imaginable? It's not guns, not cartels, not drugs. It's when the person standing at the center of the storm is someone the entire city trusts without question. And that's exactly what happened in Seattle on what should have been a calm morning at 5 a.m., when the streets were still swallowed by mist and the rumble of the underground rail hummed beneath the pavement. In the quiet northern suburbs, the kind of place people assume is filled only with middle-class families, academics, and doctors living peaceful lives, an unmarked convoy suddenly tore down the street and screeched to a halt in front of a two-story house belonging to the man Seattle's newspapers once called the humanitarian heart of the city's medical system, Dr. Lawrence Whitlock, 56. And it took just one swing of an FBI breaching hammer for Seattle to realize that sometimes the so-called humanitarian heart is exactly where the loudest heartbeat of crime is hiding. The door burst open. Inside, the house looked exactly like the photos the city had seen hundreds of times. Warm-toned family portraits, a home built on trust, a life that appeared spotless. But when agents descended into the basement, a place no journalist had ever stepped into, the truth could no longer hide. 22 kilograms of heroin stacked neatly into brick-sized blocks, a weapons cache filled with handguns, modified pistols, crates of ammunition stamped with Mexican cartel labels. And then, behind a wooden shelf, something that made even veteran agents freeze for a few seconds. A secret operating theater. Not the makeshift kind criminals throw together in cheap warehouses. This was a fully equipped surgical suite, stainless steel table, ceiling-mounted operating light, scalpels lined up in order, a brand new vital signs monitor. Everything was so clean you could almost believe you were standing in a major hospital. But no hospital in the world would allow an operating room to exist alongside heroin and cartel weapons in the same basement. And the horrifying question hanging in that sterile air was, what exactly would a doctor be doing in a secret surgical theater for a cartel? The answer revealed itself in the encrypted emails that FBI digital forensics cracked later that very morning. Not a single line mentioned emergency care, nothing about saving lives, no reference to voluntary procedures or medical ethics. The only repeated phrases were, "Move the patients tonight," "Border team ready," "Prep them in batches of 3. And at that point, everyone understood the word patients didn't mean patients. It was cartel code for trafficking victims. When agents opened the logistics folder, every suspicion hardened into a truth cold enough to numb the lungs. Inside was a list of 9 kidnapped individuals, complete with medical notes, health conditions, and expected usage levels. A hospital director in Seattle was sitting at the center of a supply chain of humans, drugs, and organs. Something the people of Seattle would never have believed possible in the city of Starbucks, Amazon, and world-class hospitals. Financial investigators discovered something that made the entire task force sit down and take a long breath. Whitlock controlled 23 shell companies stretching from Nevada to Belize and Panama. No staff, no activity, no products. Yet millions of dollars flowed through them every month under labels like medical aid, community funding, hospital equipment, all signed by him. The man Seattle believed was using his money to heal the community. But the money wasn't going into hospitals. It was going straight into offshore accounts. And in return, drugs were coming from the cartel into Seattle through the hands of a doctor in a white coat. No one had ever imagined that the person authorized to sign surgical licenses and approve medical equipment imports would be the same man funneling cartel money until the truth finally surfaced. And then at 3:40 a.m., the final picture came together. In the Federal Command Center, drone heat maps, transport timetables, GPS signals, financial reports, and decrypted emails aligned into one clear line. 9 victims were being held in a warehouse on the Everett coastline. A convoy was preparing to depart, carrying 1 ton of heroin and 1.5 tons of meth and fentanyl. 3 cartel lorries were already running. Snipers stood guard on the warehouse roof, and dawn was still hours away. If they didn't act immediately, everything would vanish into the dark. FBI HRT, DEA Fast, ICE HSI had no time left to talk. No speeches, no rallying slogans, no pre-mission rituals, only the sound of weapons being checked, body armor tightened, metal clinking in the dark. The unmarked convoy rolled out of the command center, heading straight towards Everett at a speed no one wanted to think about. And as they neared the warehouse, the first thing they saw was a silhouette moving on the roof, a cartel lookout with a rifle. None of the agents were surprised, none slowed down. The lives of 9 hostages were slipping away with every second. The opening blast hit like thunder. The DEA planted a breaching charge against the eastern wall. A white flash tore through the darkness, blowing smoke and dust outward like a tidal wave. Inside, the cartel fired back instantly. Rounds poured out of firing slits like sheets of steel rain. In front of the agents was a maze prepared with precision, chemical drums stacked into bunkers, forklifts positioned as barricades, steel staircases with gunmen ambushing from above. This wasn't a warehouse. This was a fortress. The agents were forced into close quarters, fighting so tight that sparks from muzzle flashes burst right in front of their faces. A flashbang detonated under the conveyor belt, its white light shaking the steel beams overhead. In the southwest corner, a cartel crew was dragging the 9 hostages into a refrigerated lorry, desperate to flee before sunrise. One gunman fired wildly but was knocked flat by a K-9 unit just as he tried to reload. Outside, 3 cartel trucks roared to life, ramming straight at the gate. When the helicopter swept its searchlight down, the scene below looked like something no television network would dare broadcast during prime time. And in that moment of chaos, the FBI cracked open a container marked with the code that had appeared in Whitlock's emails. The industrial lock snapped, the doors swung open. Inside were 9 people, shivering, frozen, exhausted, but alive. Outside, the final gunshots faded. The last cartel gunman tossed aside his weapon and dropped to his knees in the middle of a ring of federal agents. And as the sun began to rise over Everett's port, Seattle was finally forced to confront the biggest question of the morning. How could a doctor, the man entrusted with the city's lives, become the one feeding a cartel from within Seattle itself? Dr. Whitlock was handcuffed at 7:12 a.m. inside the same house he had used the night before as a transit hub for the cartel. His face showed no shock, no anger, no shouting. As he was pushed into the vehicle, he said nothing. And that silence made everything worse because it felt like the silence of someone who had known this day would come and still gambled everything on crime. Meanwhile, in the command center, analysts began opening every laptop, every encrypted phone, every hard drive and document seized from Whitlock's home. And within less than 2 hours, they discovered something no one in Seattle, or even in Washington, D.C., wanted to hear. Whitlock wasn't a lone deviant. He wasn't a doctor blinded by greed. He wasn't one bad apple. He was the hub of a network stretching across the entire state of Washington. No one imagined that as many as 20 officials, civil servants, and individuals in positions of authority were linked to the network. But the transfers uncovered by the FBI left no room for denial. Each one just a few thousand, sometimes tens of thousands, never large enough to seem suspicious. But accumulated over 5 years, they formed a terrifying figure. 37.9 million USD in cartel money disguised as medical funding, authorized by a doctor praised as the beacon of community healthcare. Emergency meetings were held non-stop inside government buildings. Hospital administrators re-examined every contract. Departments sifted through every document Whitlock had ever signed. Port authorities partially halted operations to re-inspect hundreds of containers that had previously been cleared without issue. Police precincts launched internal investigations into the names that appeared in the messaging logs. In some offices, department heads were called into meetings at 4 a.m. just to answer a single question. How did we overlook this for 5 years? Meanwhile, at Everett Port, the crime scene was fully sealed. The seized drugs were laid out in long rows for inventory, a total of 2.5 tons, including 1 ton of heroin and 1.5 tons of meth and fentanyl, enough to cripple the entire Pacific Northwest if it had slipped through. Next to the drugs were 324 firearms, from scrubbed serial pistols to modified rifles, all prepared for distribution into Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and Vancouver. And finally, stacks of cash, gold, and offshore banking certificates worth 52 million US dollars, all seized before they could disappear into the shadows of the global laundering system. In a city that prided itself on civilization, compassion, and progress, this betrayal struck at the very core of its identity, not because people hated Whitlock, but because they had believed in him, and it was that belief that had been sold. A machine so seamless that every component locked into place as if programmed. Containers cleared during the exact shifts of compromised port employees. Medical paperwork approved on the same days cartel shipments arrived. Community grants structured to legitimize cartel money flowing into the hospital before being funneled offshore. And private international medical meetings that were, in reality, rendezvous with human trafficking intermediaries carrying forged documents. Yet the most painful part wasn't the sophistication, it was the normality of it. There were no suitcases of cash exchanged in dark alleyways, no Mexican cartel gunmen standing at the border, no high-speed chases like in an action film. Everything happened under the bright white lights of hospital conference rooms beneath banners reading Community Health Development, where people signed memoranda with names like the Life Care Initiative. Inside the Seattle Police Department, the shock ran deep. Names appearing in Whitlock's emails, payments labeled security consultancy, late-night calls between Whitlock and a mid-ranking officer. All of it forced the department to launch an internal investigation requesting FBI oversight to avoid bias. Some officers were immediately suspended, others took sudden leave for personal reasons. And a few, the very people Seattle depended on to keep the city safe, were handcuffed right at their desks. Seattle had never experienced anything like this. And while every public agency deployed emergency measures, another truth emerged. Whitlock's betrayal didn't just erode trust, it shook the foundations of the city. For decades, people in Seattle believed two things: that doctors do not betray their patients, and that hospitals are safe places. Now that trust had been shown to have a price, and someone had sold it. Late, painful, and in circumstances almost unbearable, but it responded. Agents worked for days without sleep. Analysts traced every line of money. Raid teams risked their lives to rescue 9 strangers. Federal staff, exhausted, still wrote reports to meet court deadlines. And that was the only reason this case, despite being shocking enough to resemble a film script, didn't end in something far worse. Whitlock, once walking hospital corridors to applause, now sat shackled in a federal courtroom. 31 people indicted, 2.5 tons of narcotics seized, 52 million USD frozen before leaving the country, 324 firearms confiscated, and 9 victims, once treated as mere cargo, pulled back into the light. This story ends with a simple but heavy truth. Danger does not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it stands in a hospital boardroom wearing a badge that reads Director, speaking about compassion, and smiling at you as though it never once considered selling the soul of the very city it was meant to serve. And that was the moment the people of Seattle understood. It is not the system that protects us. It is the people within it who make that choice. And this time, one man chose power over conscience, profit over ethics, the cartel over his community. But there were others, agents, analysts, investigators, rescue teams, who chose the right side. And because of them, 9 lives were saved. A criminal machine was dismantled, and Seattle, wounded, shaken, disillusioned, still has a chance to stand again. Not because the system was flawless, but because the people within it refused to give up. That is why this story needs to be told. And if you believe that every white coat must be scrutinized, that every position of authority must be held to account, and that no one, not even the director of a major hospital, stands above the law, then you know exactly what needs to be done. And that is the entire story, a slap in the face to Seattle's assumptions, and perhaps to those of the entire United States. If you have stayed with me to the end, thank you. Stories like this are not easy to hear, but that is precisely why they must be told. Because when the truth is hidden, that is when we are most vulnerable.